Good morning. My name is Jessica Mendoza. This is the Grade Level and Content Area PLC video recording. Thank you both for being here and for being willing to engage in a deeper, more reflective conversation today. I want to start by saying how much I appreciate your openness and professionalism throughout the year. This PLC is based off of fourth grade math data reflection. Uh, it is understanding that this POC is not about rushing through numbers or simply acknowledging growth. The data we are reviewing does reflect a lot of intentional instructional work, and I want us to take the time to really unpack that. It is about understanding why we saw the outcomes we did and how we can continue to support students moving forward. I also want this to feel conversational and collaborative, not formal or evaluative. Your voices and experiences matter in making sense of the data. My role is to facilitate reflection, ask questions, and support next steps. With that in mind, let's start by grounding ourselves in the overall performance we saw in fourth grade math. Looking into the packets that I had previously given you, looking and at the TAPR data, when we look at the fourth grade math data, we there are many positives that are absolutely worth acknowledging and celebrating as a campus. The extremely high performance at the approaches level tells us that students had strong access to grade level content and that core instruction was effectively aligned to the standards. This suggests that lessons were structured, expectations were clear, and students were consistently exposed to the skills and concepts they were expected to master. Reaching this level of performance across a large group of students is not easy, and it reflects the collective effort of teachers to provide high quality Tier 1 instruction. The growth at the meets level is especially meaningful because it shows that students are not only learning the content, but are also able to apply their skills independently. In math, this level of understanding requires students to reason through problems, select appropriate strategies, and justify their thinking without heavy support. Seeing growth at this level tells us that instruction moved beyond procedural practice and focused on building conceptual understanding. It also indicates that students were given opportunities to practice problem solving in meaningful and intentional ways. What really stands out though is the increase of the master's level because that reflects deeper reasoning, flexibility in thinking, and the ability to tackle complex, multi step problems. That kind of growth does not happen by accident. It usually means instruction was intentional, consistent, and responsive to student needs. Teachers likely emphasized reasoning, discourse, and multiple strategies while also providing targeted support when students struggled. As a campus, this is something to be proud of, but it is also an opportunity to learn and reflect. I want us to think carefully about what instructional practices contributed to these results and how we can sustain them. Let's reflect on what was happening day to day in your classrooms, including routines, questioning strategies, and opportunities for students to explain their thinking even more.
Well, when I look at the data, I immediately think about how much time we spent focusing on reasoning rather than just the answers, because that was a major instructional shift this year. In the past, it can be tempting to move quickly through lessons to cover everything, but I realized that coverage does not always equal understanding. This year, I made a conscious effort to slow down during instruction and intentionally unpack the thinking behind each step, especially when problems required multiple operations or different ways to represent information. Now, instead of jumping straight to the correct answer, I instead spent more time modeling in order to allow the students to interpret the problem. identify what it is asking, and choose an appropriate strategy. It was also important that I emphasized that the process matters just as much as the solution. And I repeatedly told students that I wanted to hear how they were thinking, not just what they got. Now, during instruction, I built in structured opportunities for students to explain their reasoning out loud, and I gave them sentence stems and math vocabulary to support their explanations. I very intentionally asked follow up questions like, why did you choose that strategy? How do you know your answer makes sense? And most importantly, can you prove it another way? This pushed students beyond procedural steps and helped them develop deeper conceptual understandings. I also encourage students to share multiple strategies during lessons, like using place value models, number lines, partial products, or standard algorithms, so they could see that math is very flexible rather than rigid. When students heard peers solve the same problem in different ways, it helped them realize that there are multiple entry points and that struggling does not mean failing. Now, over time, I realized and noticed that students were becoming more confident in explaining their thinking, and that confidence showed up not just in class discussions, but also in their willingness to attempt harder and more challenging problems independently. With this, students stopped asking, is this right? After every step and started saying things such as, let me check if this makes sense, which showed a shift towards self monitoring and mathematical independence. Now, that confidence became very especially visible when we worked on multiple step problems, because students were now more willing to persist even when they didn't immediately know the answer. Instead of shutting down, they tried a strategy, revised it, and kept going. I truly believe that this mindset shift, moving from answer focused to reasoning focused, played a major role in the increase we saw at the master's level. Students were no longer afraid of challenging problems because they trusted their ability to think through them, explain their reasoning, and most importantly, justify their answers.
I really appreciate that reflection, Mr. Guerrero, because it highlights something important about instructional pacing. When we slow down and focus on reasoning, students actually gain more depth rather than losing time. I also hear you emphasizing students' confidence, which is often overlooked in math instruction. Confidence allows students to persist through challenging tasks instead of giving up. Encouraging multiple strategies helps these students understand that mistakes are part of learning, especially those that get math anxiety. I know there's a lot of students that tend to get math anxiety only because teachers tend to only show them one way, and a lot of the times they might get it, but in a different way. Those practices align well with what we know about effective math instruction. It also helps explain why students were able to move beyond procedural understanding. That kind of instruction creates thinkers, not just test takers. So remember, we always want them to actually think outside of the box. Not we don't just want to prepare them for the test. We want them to prepare them for real life situations. For example, when they go to the store, when they're purchasing something, when they grow up and purchase a house, they need to know how to find the solution to the problem that's given to them. Miss Sanchez, I'd love to hear what stood out to you when you reflected on this year.
For me, one of the biggest changes this year was being much more intentional and strategic with how I use formative data to guide instruction. Rather than viewing assessments as something that only happened at the end of a lesson or unit, I treated formative data as a daily tool to understand what students truly knew and where they were struggling. I relied heavily on exit tickets, quick checks, and informational observations to gather immediate feedback on student understanding. These data points allowed me to see patterns right away instead of guessing or assuming comprehension. Because of that, I was able to adjust instruction quickly rather than waiting until the end of a unit when misconceptions might already have been deeply ingrained. Using formative data in this way also allowed me to be more intentional with small group instruction. I spent significantly more time pulling targeted groups based on specific skill gaps or misconceptions, and I observed in student work. In those small groups, instruction has become more focused and responsive because I could address misunderstandings as soon as they appeared. Instead of reteaching an entire lesson to the whole class, I could tailor instruction to exactly what students needed in that moment. This made learning feel more manageable for students and prevented them from feeling overwhelmed. I also noticed that students responded much more positively when they felt supported rather than pressured. When instruction was adjusted based on their needs, students were more willing to ask questions and participate. Another instructional shift that made a difference was the use of consistent math routines. These routines provided structure, predictability, and these have helped reduce anxiety and allowed students to focus on the math itself. Because students knew what to expect, they felt more comfortable taking risks and engaging in challenging tasks. Overall, I believe these instruction decisions, using formative data intentionally, providing targeted small group support, and establishing consistent routines, played a significant role in academic growth reflected in the data.
What you're describing, Ms. Sanchez, is a strong example of responsive teaching. Using formative data in real time allows instruction to meet students where they are. I also hear a strong emphasis on small group instruction, which is critical for differentiation. When students feel supported, they are more willing to engage and try. Consistent routines also reduce cognitive load, allowing students to focus on the math rather than process. All of this helps explain why students demonstrated growth across performance levels. It also tells us that instructional consistency matters just as much as instructional strategy. These are practices we want to sustain across the grade level. Let's shift now and talk specifically about student growth. When we look at growth data in the packets that I was given to you, we see that many students did make progress, but we also know that not all students grew at the same rate. Growth data gives us insight into how instruction impacted individual learners over time. With that being said, it helps us move beyond proficiency and focus on progress. I want us to think about what differentiated instruction looked like in your classrooms. Which students benefited the most and why? What supports seemed to make the biggest difference? This is not about blame, but about learning how to make our instruction better for our students. Understanding growth patterns help us refine our instructional approach. Mr. Guerrero, what did you notice from your point of view?
I noticed that students who showed the most growth were often the ones who received consistent small group support, and this pattern became even clearer as the year progressed, and we collected more frequent progress monitoring data. In these small groups, instruction was much more targeted and responsive, which allowed me to address the exact skill gap students had instead of reteaching an entire lesson to the whole class. I could focus on specific misconceptions like place value errors, misunderstanding of multiplication and division relationships, or confusion about what remainder means in context, without overwhelming students who were already secure in those skills. Students benefited from frequent feedback because they were able to correct errors in the moment and immediately apply new strategies while the learning was still fresh. The feedback also helped students learn that making mistakes was not a dead end, but a normal part of learning that could be fixed with the right strategy. Breaking concepts down into manageable steps helps students build understanding gradually, and this improved their confidence because they experienced success much more consistently. In small groups, I was also able to check for understanding more closely by asking questions, listening carefully to student explanations, and watching their work step by step instead of only seeing the final answer. I could quickly identify whether a student truly understood a concept or was simply copying a process without meaning. Over time, these small group routines build stronger habits of thinking, stronger perseverance, and stronger mathematical language, especially for students who need support. Most importantly, it created a learning environment where students felt safe to admit confusion and ask for help without feeling embarrassed. On the other hand, students who struggled to show growth often had difficulty with word problems in academic language, and that barrier repeatedly showed up even when they had the computational skills to solve the problem. Even when these students understood the underlying math concept, they struggled to interpret what the problem was asking, identify relevant information, or determine which operation to use. This highlighted how closely language and math performance was connected, especially in fourth grade, where problems became more complex and required multi step reasoning. Students who had trouble decoding vocabulary or sentence structure often became frustrated before they even attempted to solve the problem because the task felt confusing and unclear from the start. For example, students might not understand terms like compare, represent, equivalent, estimate, factor, or product, or they might misinterpret phrases like how many more or how much is left. If students cannot translate the language into a mathematical plan, they may either guess or shut down. Now, as a result, some students avoided participating, rushed through problems without thinking, or waited for an adult to tell them what to do because the reading demands felt too high. Over time, the avoidance pattern became a confidence issue where students started believing they can't do math, when the real issue is comprehension and academic vocabulary. This showed me that strengthening math language support is not optional, it is essential if we want equitable access to the grade level curriculum. It also helped me understand that improving word problem performance requires explicit instruction in how to read like a mathematician, not just more practice problems. I also noticed that confidence played a major role in whether students persisted through challenging problems, and it often determined whether students were willing to attempt a strategy independently. Students who lacked confidence were more likely to give up quickly, freeze, or wait for help rather than take an academic risk, even when they had the skills needed to solve the task. Some students would immediately say, I don't get it, without trying, because they were afraid of being wrong or felt overwhelmed by the amount of text or steps involved. When I provided sentence stems, visual models, and guided examples, those same students became more willing to participate and share their thinking because the support gave them a clear starting point. Sentence stems helped them express reasoning without feeling stuck on words, and visuals helped them organize information and reduce confusion. Guided examples also help them see that complex problems can be broken down into simple parts, which made the task feel manageable. These supports did not lower rigor, instead, they removed barriers so students could access the same high level thinking as their peers. I also found that celebrating partial success, like identifying the correct operation or explaining one step clearly, helped build confidence over time. This experience reinforced for me that language and confidence are critical factors in math achievement, and that growth depends on students believing they can engage with challenging tasks. Addressing these barriers through intentional scaffolding, consistent routines, and supportive instruction is essential for helping all students grow, persist, and succeed in mathematics.
That observation is incredibly important, especially the connection between language and math understanding, because math is not just numbers, it's also interpretation, reasoning, and communication. We sometimes underestimate how much reading comprehension impacts math performance, but students can't demonstrate what they know if they cannot decode the question, understand key vocabulary, or determine what the problem is truly asking. When a student struggles like with terms like difference, compare, total, product, equivalent, estimate, or even justify, they may shut down before they even attempt the computation. This is why supporting students with vocabulary and sentence structure is not extra. It is part of our access to grade level math. When we explicitly teach vocabulary, model how to unpack word problems, and provide sentence stems, students are better able to translate words into mathematical actions and actually explain their thinking. I also hear you naming confidence as a factor as well. And that is huge because confidence often determines whether a student will persist through product struggle or give up at the first sign of difficulty. Students who don't feel successful in math sometimes avoid participating, rush to copy, or stop trying because they assume they will be wrong. As leaders, we can address this through instructional practices that normalize mistakes, emphasize growth, and give students structured opportunities to experience success. For example, using think alouds, gradual release, and small group support can build confidence because students see the process and feel supported step by step. Providing scaffolds doesn't lower rigor, but it increases access because it removes barriers without removing the cognitive demand. Scaffolds like graphic organizers, problem solving templates, vocabulary visuals, anchor charts, and sentence stems help students engage with complex tasks rather than being excluded by language or uncertainty. These insights push us to think more intentionally about lesson design. We need lessons that include vocabulary routines, opportunities for mouth talk, time for students to process language, and multiple entry points so that every student can participate. We also need to ensure our questioning invites reasoning, not just answers, so students can actually practice explaining their thinking in a safe, structured way. Ms. Sanchez, did you notice similar patterns in your classroom, especially with the students who struggled most with word problems or even math discourse?
Yeah, I noticed many of the same things, especially when it came to student confidence and their willingness to engage with challenging math tasks. The students who showed the most growth were consistently the ones who felt comfortable asking the questions, sharing their thinking, and taking the risks during the lessons. When students trusted that their mistakes were a part of the learning process and not something to be embarrassed about, they were much more engaged and willing to persist through difficult problems. Creating that sense of psychological safety in the classroom made a noticeable difference in how students approached math. I also noticed that the students who struggled to show growth often needed more explicit support with math vocabulary and language. Even when they understood the mathematical concept, unfamiliar terms or complex wording and problems became a barrier. Once I began intentionally teaching math vocabulary, using visuals, anchor charts, and examples, students' comprehensions improved. They were better able to interpret questions and determine what steps were needed to solve them. The shift reinforced how closely language and math understanding are connected. Another strategy that made a significant impact was giving students time to talk through problems before writing or solving them independently. Allowing students to verbalize their thinking helped them organize ideas and clarify their understanding. I also saw improvement when I modeled how to break down word problems step by step, explicitly showing them how to identify key information and ignore distractions. These strategies made math feel more manageable and less intimidating for students. Overall, this experience reinforced the importance of addressing both academic and emotional needs, as students learn the best when they feel supported, confident, and capable.
These reflections really reinforce the idea that effective math instruction is multifaceted and deeply interconnected. It's not just about delivering content or covering standards, but about intentionally addressing language development, student confidence, and the overall classroom culture that supports learning. When students feel safe to take risks and ask questions and even explain their thinking, they are far more likely to engage in productive struggle and persist through challenging tasks. Language plays a critical part in this process, as students must be able to interpret problems, articulate strategies, and justify their reasoning both orally and in writing. Confidence grows when students experience success through structured support and consistent routines. And classroom culture is strengthened when mistakes are treated as learning opportunities rather than failures. As we think about next steps, it is important that we identify instructional priorities that allow us to sustain the gains we've made, also while pushing students toward higher levels of mastery. These priorities should not represent a complete overhaul of instruction, but rather a refinement of practices that are already proving effective. Based on our conversation, enrichment, math writing, and intentional questioning clearly stand out as areas of focus. Enrichment allows us to extend learning for students who have mastered grade level content and are ready for greater cognitive challenge. Math writing supports deeper understanding by requiring students to explain their thinking, make connections, and even reflect on their problem solving process. Intentional questioning pushes students beyond procedural answers and encourages higher order thinking, reasoning, and justification, which is our ultimate goal for them. Implementing these priorities consistently will require intentional planning and collaboration. This might look like embedding structured enrichment tasks into weekly lesson plans, incorporating daily or weekly math writing opportunities and higher level questions in advance rather than relying on spontaneous prompts. It is also this also means using PLC time to share strategies, analyze student work, and reflect on what is working. By approaching these priorities with consistency and purpose, we can ensure that all students continue to grow and that our instructional practices remain aligned with our shared goals.
I think enrichment needs to be much more intentional moving forward, especially for students who master grade level content quickly and are ready for deeper challenges. Too often, enrichment becomes an afterthought or something students only receive if there is extra time, rather than a planned component of instruction. When enrichment is structured and aligned to the standard, it allows students to extend their thinking, make connections, and most importantly, apply those skills in more complex and meaningful ways. These students benefit from tasks that require higher order reasoning, problem solving, and justification rather than simply more of the same practice. In essence, providing consistent enrichment opportunities also helps maintain engagement and prevents advanced students from becoming disengaged or complacent. I strongly believe that math writing should remain a central focus of our instruction. Writing forces students to slow down and articulate their reasoning, which in turn deepens their understanding and strengthens their conceptual thinking. Now, when students explain their thinking in writing, it becomes much easier to identify misconceptions that might not appear in multiple choice assessments or otherwise short answers. Math writing also supports academic language development, which is critical for success on complex word problems and higher level assessments. Now, over time, consistent writing helps students become more precise in their explanations, and most importantly, more confident in defending their reasoning. Overall, another area where we can continue to improve is collaboration and sharing strategies across classrooms. When teachers openly share resources, lesson ideas, and successful instructional practices, we create greater consistency for students across the grade level. Collaboration also allows us to learn from one another and refine our practices collectively, rather than working in isolation. Now, I am very open to sharing resources, enrichment tasks, and strategies that have worked well in my classroom, and I'm equally eager to learn from others. By intentionally focusing on enrichment, math writing, and collaboration, we can build on our current success and continue to push student learning forward in a meaningful and sustainable way.
I agree with Mr. Guerrero, and I strongly believe that enrichment is essential for keeping advanced students engaged, motivated, and continuously growing. When students quickly master grade level content, they need intentional opportunities to extend their learning rather than waiting for others to catch up. Well designated enrichment tasks challenge students to apply concepts in new ways, analyze patterns, and justify their reasoning at a deeper level. This type of enrichment not only supports their academic growth, but also helps them maintain student interest and enthusiasm for learning. Without these opportunities, advanced students can become disengaged or complacent, which would limit their potential. I also think that questioning techniques play a critical role in pushing students towards higher levels of thinking. Asking higher order questions encourages students to move beyond procedural answers and explain the why behind their reasoning. Questions that prompt analysis, comparison, and justification help these students develop critical thinking skills and deepen conceptual understanding. Being intentional with questioning also allows us teachers to assess student understanding in real time and adjust instruction accordingly. Over time, our students become more comfortable articulating their thinking and defending their solutions. Another powerful strategy is using student work as a discussion tool during lessons. When us teachers intentionally select and share student work, it creates opportunities for students to learn from one another's perspective and strategies. Discussing different approaches helps the students see that there are multiple ways to solve a problem and reinforces flexible thinking. I am very willing to collaborate and share my strategies that have worked well in my classroom, especially those related to enrichment, questioning, and student discourse. Consistency across classrooms benefits both students and teachers by creating shared expectations and a cohesive learning experience. Overall, these priorities feel realistic, sustainable, and impactful, and they build on the strong instructional foundation that we already have in place.
I appreciate both of your insights and your willingness to collaborate. From your leadership perspective to my role is to support these priorities and remove barriers. I will ensure PLC time remains protected and focused on instruction. I will also conduct walkthroughs with an emphasis on math discourse, reasoning, and student engagement. Feedback will be supportive, of course, and aligned to our shared goals. Additionally, I will work to provide resources and professional development aligned to enrichment and math writing. Accountability will focus on reflection and growth rather than compliance. I am confident that by working together, we can continue to strengthen instruction and student outcomes. Before we close, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the work you've done, the and the impact it has had on students. The data reflects thoughtful planning, collaboration, and a commitment to continuous improvement, as stated before. Our focus moving forward is refinement, not reinvention. We will build on what works and continues to support one another. Thank you for your honesty, professionalism, and dedication to students. I am proud of the work happening in fourth grade math. I look forward to continuing this work together.